Wait, don't go yet.
Don't go.
Wait, don't go.
Oh, yes.
Yes,
we
do
live.
go.
Are we
Okay.
going?
Yes, no.
We're going?
Yes.
We're going.
Okay.
Hi. Hi, everybody. That's Ben.
Yeah.
And JB.
Yes, this is JB. If you haven't seen JB in here in a while, JB is a UI person, programmer.
Programmer, do UI, and other things.
Other things
Do
as well.
our grouping systems design as well, and UI design and implementation, and API server, things like that.
Things like that.
Yep. So if you have questions about that in the Q&A, I can answer that kind of stuff.
And we have our Camelot Unchained weekly top 10 list. So, what are we talking about?
First thing, we'll just jump right into it. On number 1, we have ability scalability tests. And as we mentioned last week, we had that update with the 2809 number, which then got increased. We are now over 3,000, which is huge on the ARCs, the autonomous remote clients, as we call them, which are basically actual clients with all the full networking, just running on AWS servers, not the same ones as our game servers, just completely separate, going over all the network traffic, with over 3,000 of those, along with players, which we've had quite a lot of players as well, and the tests have been going great. We get pretty good frame rates. I think it starts dying right now at around like 3,400, I think it was, which we're still working on getting that improved, but it's going good.
Yeah. And number 2, improved ability system. So our gameplay team has been busy bringing the improved system to life. Andrew, Christina, Rob, Anthony, and Caleb have all been working on getting the system into a state that will allow us and you to create some pretty awesome abilities. So as you guys have probably heard every once in a while, we're still working on getting abilities together, which will allow us to put together mages and have the rest of the classes have more abilities than they currently have, and turn back on the ability builder so that you can actually take a bunch of components and build those into custom abilities for your class. So yeah, a lot of people are working on that. Still work in progress, but there's a lot going on with that that's pretty interesting right now. And then we have number 3, Rubble. Colin has made some changes to how rubble and building are generated. This should improve performance. So this is the performance. If you guys have seen any of the videos with castles falling apart and bouncing and things like that, that's still being worked on as well. And Colin is working on especially improving the performance when that happens, so that we have no stutters or lag or anything when these buildings fall apart and we have to do a bunch of physics calculations for all the bits of building that go flying everywhere. So that's what we're working on.
And when they crush you.
Yes, and they actually crush you now, and so if a building falls on you, you will take damage and probably die. So that's definitely improvement.
Yep. All right, so number 4 is me. I have completed the initial design and wireframes for the ability builder interface, as Ben was just talking about in number 2 about the ability system work. So that is starting the process on giving the power to you to create abilities again, which we used to have a while ago in the old system. So that is now being handed off to James Koo, who is doing the like full out arted up concept of it, making it pretty and all that stuff. And then number 5 is work in progress battle groups. AJ has added the ability and has fixed some things so that the battle groups are now working again on Hatchery, our internal testing client. So, and also he added the ability so that you can like right click on another player's health bar and then invite them to a battle group, which we had you could invite them to warbands. Now you can also create battle groups and invite people to your battle group.
Is the invite out from under the UI for the scenario now, so you can actually click
that is also, that is fixed. We fixed that like 3 weeks ago or something like that. But But yeah, now, so when you get an invite, what
You
Ben's
can
talking about, you can
accept it.
actually accept it.
Yeah.
Because we had a scoreboard UI that was covering it up, and that was not fun.
All right. Number 6, work in progress, art, tech, design, mages, coming soon. So this is a pretty long list of things here. So myself and Anthony are working on creating mage abilities. Most of the Flame Warden runes and mage shapes and traits are complete. There's still quite a bit to do as far as the rest of their components, but that's at least a pretty good start. We're getting the first version of everything is hard and takes longer, but once you've got a few examples, you can take from those examples and extrapolate on it more. So that'll speed up now that we've got a few things going. And then part B of this, John and Dion have been working on creating wands and scepters for 2 of the mage classes, which is the Flame Warden and the Druid. And the Wave Weaver gauntlets are next. So they're going to get through all those, which are the focus items for those classes that will give them different effects to their abilities depending on which one they use. And then part C of this, Mike and DB have begun work on the VFX and SFX for the mage abilities. They're working on creating the starting abilities first and then moving on to the rest of the spell variations. So that's just to get all the particles and sounds and everything working along with the actual effects of the abilities, like the systemic things that is being worked on in code. So getting all those pieces together, a lot has to come together to make these things work. And then Scott is working on the shared set of mage animations using the 2.0 character changes. So that's whole new characters with a new rig, new skeleton, and new animations all going together. So there will be new characters, new animations, new visual effects, new sound effects, and new abilities. All this stuff is coming, and that's all one item here in what's going on with mages.
All right. Now, number 7, also art-related, updated Valkyries. Dion, who just had a birthday recently, has just finished up getting the Viking armors. It was on the sheet. They're laughing over there because, like, we just talked about this. But so Dion has finished fitting the Viking armors to John's new Valkyrie models. These assets, including the nude meshes, are in Joe's hands to wait and get into game. So that's hooking it up to the skeleton, like rigging it, getting all the vertices linked up so it moves and doesn't stretch and stuff in the game. And then Scott and Tyler prepped much of the assets, awaiting the final models. So once they're basically the Scott and Tyler getting the animation and stuff ready, so there'll be new Valkyries soon, which are cool.
New Valkyries, new humans, new everything, which is
New
characters
everything.
2.0, right? We're totally redoing all the
Which
characters.
might be another thing later that we talk about.
Yeah.
In a couple numbers.
Oh, okay. So, yeah, we'll talk about that later. So number 8, art effects, improved siege effects. So Mike and DB have created new effects for the Sapper Bomb, which some of you have seen, which is no longer a Christmas present, but is an actual magic bomb thing now.
So no more Merry Christmas.
Yeah, no more
Boom.
Merry Christmas explosions. That is now out of season. And Mike has worked on the improved Scorpion and Trebuchet effects, which I was looking at those earlier. They're actually looking pretty good. So we're going to have some new siege effects for basically all the different siege things that we've got going on right now. And then number 9, realm-specific trebuchets. Joe has rigged all 3 realm-specific trebuchets, which should add visual clarity in large battles. So now you'll be able to see, they're pretty similar in their models, but they're vastly different colors, so you can definitely tell from a distance like which one you're looking at. And these will be available sometime in the current siege testing coming soon.
Yay, new trebs.
Yes.
All right. Last but not least, certainly, number 10 on here is Characters 2.0, which Ben had mentioned earlier. This is better looking and more performant characters. Just kind of all around how our characters work is being updated and made better. So the first part on this, number A, is Sandra and Scott have finished retargeting all the Lutrapan 2.0 animations. At a later date, we'll consider unique animations for these guys. Scott and Sandra have now moved to the cleanup of the rough pass retargeted animations in preparation for pushing them to master later. So if you don't know what any of that means, our animations are made for a human, and the humans have certain proportions. The Lutrapans have different proportions, so like their fingers are different sizes, and like their forearms are different sizes and stuff.
And they're short.
They're short. So to get a human animation onto the Lutrapan model, things have to be adjusted, and that's what the retargeting is, and that's what that involves. B. Scott and Tyler have imported and set up all the undergarment items for our existing races and genders. These items support our layered armor system, which means you can see their underwear through their clothes. Pretty much. C. Joe has rigged and skinned the various capes needed for the 2.0 changes. So, cool looking capes on the 2.0. D. We've tracked down and resolved numerous technical issues associated with getting new skeletons, models, equipment, and animations to work correctly. While Art cleans up the new work, we're getting back to supporting improvements in the animation system, as well as integrating the artist-created character LODs. So, there's a couple parts in there. Animations, imports are always a fun thing where you get weird-looking monster creatures
Animation
when they
bugs are
don't
the best
import right,
bugs.
those bugs, and so those are getting fixed up. And yeah, artists will be creating our LODs now rather than us generating them, which means that the LOD should look better because it's not just our program just making them.
Yeah,
It's
we're no longer
artists
just automatically
hand
taking
making
away
them.
the triangles and
Yeah.
reducing the detail. We're letting artists make a lower detailed version that when it's off in the distance, you can't really tell the difference between that and the high detail version, which is up close. So that should make the game look better because it's artist defined instead of code defined, and hopefully perform better too because we can save some more polygons and things.
Yep. So those are the top 10.
Yep, that's it for top 10 this week. So let's get into the question and answer.
It was actually 10 this week.
Yes, we actually did 10 in our top 10 list, which is rare.
Unusual.
But there were a lot of like sub items too, so
Yeah.
there's a lot of stuff going on for sure.
All right, folks, give us your questions. So we have Ben for your noodly design questions and JB for your obscure programming questions. And those of you saying we should release our game, we're working on it.
Yes, we want the game released.
That's why we're doing these things,
That's why
because
we're doing it.
if we don't have things like characters and we don't have classes like mages and we don't have all these siege engines, we don't have very much of a game. So we got to get all these things completed, but we're trying to get there as soon as we can.
Drooged asked, Hey JB, MJ wasn't sure. Does the new crafting UI expose any crafting function that is not available now?
Not available now. So, yes, one of the biggest things I think the new crafting interface does that the current one, the temporary one, does not, is it allows you to just browse and see what you can make without having to open up Google Sheets and look at the recipes. So like for shaping recipes, making alloys, and making the items, you can just browse and see what can I make right now. That's not entirely how the end game crafting is going to be, because there's going to be a lot more discoverability, but as of right now, in the current version, there's not a lot of that, so you'll be able to just see what can I do and just find it easily and make it. So you don't have to go through the trouble of searching through our forums and Google Sheets.
Yeah. And the other thing is that you like don't have to input the exact quantities of things, which I really like.
Yes,
So
you also
can
don't have
just
to do that.
Drag a stack onto the right slot in the UI and just hit go, and it'll consume as much of it as it needs. So you don't have to be very careful about how many of each thing you put in each slot.
Yeah, it tries to be much nicer to you in that way, so you don't have to be like select slot primary, add this exact thing, select slot secondary,
and you
add
can
this
queue
exact
things up
thing.
too. Could you do that?
You can also queue things. That is true. So we added a queue system. I think it's like 8 or something like that right now. You can start crafting a job. You can configure and start a new job while the first one's running. Only one can run at a time right now, but you can get, I think it's like 8 jobs just queued up. So if a job takes like 2.5 hours to make something, you don't have to stay and wait. And when the 2.5 hours is over, it'll just go to the next thing.
The Lotus Wraith asks, how precise will trebuchets be? Right now you can pound the same brick in the same spot, at the same angle, with each dangerously precise shot.
Yeah, everything as far as accuracy right now is pretty exact. We don't have any kind of like spread or automatic adjustment that will throw off your aim right now. We're going to be looking into that a little bit as we get further along, but right now the simplest way to implement this was just to do the direct physics calculation and leave it as it's determined. So we'll see how that goes. If you guys have any feedback about that as you get into trying it out, let us know. If you're like, well, this needs to be more random, or it needs to have a spread, or it needs to have some degree of variance just to make it more fair or make it more difficult or something. I'm open to looking into that. But right now it works the way it works, just to get testing and make sure we can knock down buildings and make sure that we have control over the defined behaviors, right? Because if we put a bunch of randomization in, it then becomes much harder for us to know if it's doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing. So it's always best, just in terms of development, to start off with doing something exact and making sure you get exactly the thing you were expecting, and then add variance on top of that, rather than starting out with a bunch of variance and then not realizing that your variance was masking the fact that you were off by some amount, and you had just interpreted it as being part of the variance.
Arbindel in the YouTube chat asks, how are animation and skill effects, skill S effects, anticipated to affect server stability while in the background? Has this been tested for large battles?
Yeah, well, we've definitely tested it in large battles. Anytime we're doing scalability testing, we're actually talking just a little while ago with Tim about how we're wanting to do some scalability tests that don't involve that. Specifically because we're going to be running live servers that have a bunch of players running around who aren't necessarily engaged in battle 100% of the time. So it's going to be a lot of players who aren't fighting necessarily, who are going to still be on the server, and we need to make sure that our servers scale for that. But anytime we do tests right now, we're doing them with combat turned on and NPCs or ARCs, autonomous remote clients.
Yeah, our ARCs
using
are actually, they're just firing abilities constantly.
Yeah.
And they're non-stop firing, unlike players.
Yeah, players would run around and use their abilities more tactically, whereas bots and arcs they just spam constantly. So they're actually heavier than players would be in most cases. As far as how that affects stability, I'm not sure that VFX and SFX affect server stability at all, because they're not actually simulated on the server.
They're not simulated.
The abilities are like physics is on the physics server, not on the game server. But the VFX and SFX are primarily concerned on the client, so that'll
There's
be
just a slight amount, because I got to figure out which one to play and tell the client that. But
yeah, because
it's not much.
Yeah, because we do have to message that down and say, hey, client, play these particles and things. But for the most part, that's a client concern. So you'll if you get too much stuff going on your screen, obviously you're going to see reduced frame rates and things like that. But we're trying to make sure that all of our stuff is very economical as far as its performance impact. And we've got, like we said, like 3,000 of these guys running around, all using abilities, particles going off, animations playing, sounds happening, and that all works. So we're doing pretty well, I think. So not something that we're being concerned about at the moment, of not being able to support all that.
ILR on the YouTube chat asks about UI. How much informative transparency will you be aiming for in the usually hidden stats of skills?
So this is kind of we kind of are going, at least in the beta, until we get up to launch, we're just kind of overloading information as much as possible, especially with all the skills, and just kind of giving you all the data that is possible, and through both our API server and through the client, and like our combat logs, of just giving you a ton of information. Ben can go into more detail about what we do and don't want to show eventually, probably, but like right now it's just kind of everything that is even there.
Yeah, in terms of letting you know what's going on with your abilities, we're trying to make sure that you have a reasonable expectation of what your ability is going to do before you use it. We're working on some new UI features that will give you better tooltips, like in the ability builder, like we were talking about earlier. As you're creating your abilities and picking what components to assemble to even go into an ability, what data actually gets displayed there? How do we do the calculations to say, well, when you put this component together and this component together, it will deal X amount of damage and things like that. we're working on making sure that all happens, because we do want you to have a reasonable expectation for what your abilities will do, estimation for how much of each of the stats they will do, and there isn't really a reason necessarily to try to obscure all of that. There might be cases in the future where we get into some unknowns, where if you're discovering new components or having to go out and find things and use different infusions, you might not necessarily know all the information about them until you've used them, but once you've used them, they'll be logged into your history, and you'll be able to go back and look and see what they did, so you'll be able to figure these things out as you go. So there's not too much obscurity there. We're not just gonna put a bunch of abilities on your character and let you use them and then estimate what's happened. We're gonna give you hopefully as much data as you need to be able to figure these things out.
Adricortesia asks, for Ben, I've seen many class design topics in the last few weeks. How far have you designed the classes that were mentioned?
I don't know exactly what you're referring to there, but right now we've gone through a few of the classes in very much detail to give an idea of where we want to get those by launch, and then we've gone into almost all of the classes at a lower level of detail, a lower level of content, where they all have I think 30 to 50 components, let's say, and they have at least a starting set and their traits and their components, so that we can go through and do like a first pass on each of these. And so right now there's all of the general combat classes. I think scouts still need theirs and crafters still need theirs. So there's a little bit more design work to be done on those, but we're much farther along on design than we are in implementation right now. Right now we're trying to get those simplified versions of the mages all put together, and then we'll go back through and add the rest of the starting components for the fighters and archers and healers, and then we'll branch off into further classes beyond that. So once we get a good amount of classes to where they need to be for a starter set of everything, we'll start elaborating and expanding upon those skill sets and hopefully refining the things that we already put in, because right now all this design is on paper. So once it goes into the game, we're going to find out that some things work really well, some things work too well, some things don't work well enough, and we'll be iterating and refining a lot of that too. So there'll be a lot of things that go on once we get into testing, and a lot more things that go in once we get a little bit further in our ability system and we get a lot of these things out of code and into editors, and are able to iterate a lot more quickly than we are now, as we're first putting in the first of the classes, which are the mages.
Let's see. Unknown RH asks, when do we expect that mages presentation?
Oh, I don't know. That was talked about quite a while ago, I think, by Mark, and that's kind of up to him whenever he wants to schedule it. We can do that whenever he's available. So you'll have to ask him whenever he wants to do it. But that might not be until we get a version of them we can really start showing off, because we want to show off some of their cool effects and abilities and things at the same time. So I'm not sure where that is on the schedule. But next time you see Mark, ask him and see if he has an answer for you.
The man with no screen name asks, what will be the size, mass, and weight limit to projectiles fired from trebuchets and scorpions?
Wow.
That's very specific.
Yeah. We haven't specified exactly what those will be. There will be some. A lot of these projectiles are going to be just purely based on specific unit counts and types of things. So when you have scorpion bolts, for example, we're not actually calculating, well, does this weigh too much for the scorpion? Because it's made for the scorpion, so that's just going to allow it to work. But when we get into things using more exact physics, then it will be a lot more based on how heavy was the thing that you put there, and when you pulled the lever, did it have enough force to push it? And so we haven't gotten into the details of all that yet, to be honest. We're still working on primarily the basic siege engines that are purely driven by abilities. So the siege engine works because it's consuming the type of ammunition that it's given, and it's dealing the amount of damage that its ammunition has defined in its stats and its definition. So right now we're not really worried about things like how much does it weigh. We're just worried about what are its stats, how much velocity does it have based on the ability that it's using, and that's how that's all calculated for the first pass.
Some of these questions, folks, would be better directed toward Mark, like what are the next big steps in the testing phase, etc. So we'll come back to those. Ask them again when Mark is on. Let's see. Let's do one for JB. Drooged asks, "Hey JB, are there any more thoughts on how a map would get implemented in the game? Fog of war, battles seen by allies showing up, context clicking and hovering, or is it just a 2D map?"
So we have talked a little bit about this, and there's more planning that has to go into what the final map's going to be like. But the direction that we kind of want to go is not specifically set in stone on whether it'll be on the looks yet, but more about what information is available, and being that we have scout classes and stuff, like we want to make them useful in conveying information to the player on their map instead of you just kind of knowing and seeing everything and where everything else is all the time. Making use of those classes to help you find out what's going on in the world, like that you're not directly seeing. If you have like in kind of a typical fog of war, but getting information about that outside of what you've experienced yourself in your own history.
So the map
really
itself, the display for the map itself, right, is going to be some form of stylization of the overall topology that we're getting out of the terrain system, right? So we have to somehow draw the world such as it is. And then we've got a layer of like dynamic entities that get layered on top of that for things like places of power and plots and other nodes and things that are going on in the world. But then the updates for those are driven by players going out and exploring, and they're not just going to be available to be seen all the time, basically.
Yeah.
The Lotus Wraith wants to know, what will the Devout's skill set look like in terms of pairing effects with delivery methods? Can healing and damaging effects use some of the same delivery systems?
So this healing and damaging effects deliver some of the same systems. So if you're talking about like, can you do a healing projectile and a damaging projectile? Yeah, there's a lot of overlap for things like that when you get into like the very base, like primitive sort of things. And so when you have something like a damage aura versus a healing aura, or a damage cast area versus a healing cast area, like a lot of those things can be shared in both ways. But it's like Devouts are specifically kind of utilitarian in that they do both of their things at the same time. So they'll have a lot of effects that are, this damages enemies and heals allies, or this debuffs enemies and grants allies something, or this gives you a charge that you're able to use then on some other ability that will do something else good. So there's sort of a good and bad sort of balance to most of their abilities. So they try to do both of these things at the same time, and that's so that you're not getting this sort of divergent focus where you have one Devout who's focused on only offense and one Devout who's focused on only defense. You sort of have to do both in order to really fulfill your role. So that's the idea of these guys anyway, so we don't have these sort of hybrid healers that are really just healers or really just damage, and you don't have the complaints that you sometimes get in some games where, you know, your healer specs DPS, and why is there a healer if there's just going to be DPS and things like that. So they really are trying to do both of these roles simultaneously, and their abilities are sort of geared to do that.
Yeah, we kind of don't want them to just be not as good of a healer and not as good of a DPS.
Yeah,
right?
and that's the sort of thing that happens
overall.
sometimes in these games. If you've played a lot of PvP MMOs, you've sort of seen this happen, right? Where you have a healer who can spec into damage and just be sort of bad at damage, or a hybrid that's just sort of halfway good at two different things doesn't necessarily make them good at either role. You're better off just taking somebody who's a purist and they're more effective. So that's something we want to avoid anytime you get into hybrids and balancing roles and things, is to make sure that characters are fully effective at doing something, even if that something is multitasking or balancing between things that normally would be considered different roles.
Critical Danny asks, how is the ability builder coming along, and when will the air system come?
So the ability builder, as far as the UI, if that's what you're caring about, as we talked about in the top 10, has been wireframe designed and is being art concepted right now by James Q.
I think there's a dev UI version of it that works right now.
There is a dev UI version of it that some of the guys have been using. I think Rob has been working on that.
Yeah,
and using that to create abilities.
Yeah, so we have a version of it that we internally use to build abilities right now because we don't have an art official UI for it yet. But then the official version of the UI is something that's a work in progress. And once that's all put together, we still need the rest of the actual content, the actual components and the actual classes to have all their things so that they can be built and used. So there's a lot of things that have to come together for that. But we're working on them all right now. We said a lot of them in the top 10 today. And we're hoping to get those into at least some early internal testing here pretty soon. So watch out for that. We'll be telling you about them probably in all of our updates until you see them. So we'll be giving you regular updates until those are ready to be seen.
What was the second half of the question? Because I forgot.
When will the air system come?
Oh, okay.
So the air, for those of you who may not know, air is ability, interaction, and reactions, which is when two different magic types interact, what happens. Since that's part of magic, that's something that I would like to see coming online along with the mage classes, but that might not happen at the very first. As we're very first getting into it, it's just, here are components, here are ability effects, can we even do a spell like push a button, cost blood, cost stamina, invoke projectile, have a physics object, have it collide with somebody, impart their effects, apply a status to them, display an icon, all of the very fundamental basics working, and then get into things like, well, when one type of magic hits another type of magic, do a lookup to what the results of that should be, and then create resultant effects based on that. So that'll probably be a further step after that, but hopefully it won't be too long, because getting mages into the game and having that gameplay, a large part of it, what makes it interesting, is that ability to have interactions and have different mages casting different spells and having those spells hit each other and crazy things happening. So that's something that we're still very much interested in doing and very enthusiastic about getting into the game. Hopefully it will be not too long after mages are first implemented and working on under a very basic context. So we'll see them hopefully coming in pretty soon.
Nanulak asks, will BPOs actually block LOS or obstruct projectiles?
Well, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they're actual items that have collision that are in the world, and anything in the world that has collision will block projectiles and line of sight. So, if you put down a chair in front of your door and you want to stand behind it as somebody casts magic spells at you through the door, well, it'll hit the chair and not hit you. And it may damage the chair and set the chair on fire and kill it.
Yeah. Importantly, those can be destroyed, so
Yeah.
It's not just, here are a bunch of indestructible items that you can use instead of walls. All that stuff can be destroyed, and hopefully have some partially destroyed states too, which is one of the things that I want to see from BPOs at least, is their ability to not only, if you have a statue in your house, not only can you have the statue be destroyed and just poof out of existence, but you can damage it and knock it over and have the rubble from the statue and then hide behind a broken statue. And I think that'll be cool, but we'll see how that goes.
Midgard Storm asks, are the beards in-game designed with actual development team members' beards as templates? You guys all have some rocking beards. Maybe make a special edition Camelot Unchained beard unlock. That would be awesome.
I mean, I think that's a question for John, but I think he does. I don't know. John's watching over there. I don't know if he'll hear us in like 30 seconds and look over or not. We'll see. Oh, he's turning. Do you use any of our real beards in the designs?
I took a bunch of pictures of MJ's scruff.
Yeah, so if you didn't hear him, he said he took a bunch of pictures of MJ's scruff a while back and used that in our characters for some of their beards.
I haven't made any beards yet, so when I get to that point, I'm coming to you too.
He said he hasn't made any full beards yet, just kind of scruff in game, and he's been doing that. But he said he'll come use our beards when he gets to that point. So the answer is yes, it probably will in the future.
Unknown RH asks, will the air system allow for different interactions between elements depending on if fired from the same realm or not? Like fire and water from the same realm will turn into steam, but fire and water fired from opposing realms will cancel each other out?
That's one of the things that I've been looking into, of whether we wanted to have different effects for oppositional ownership, or whether we wanted to have different effects for like same realm ownership. Right now, everything is sort of the same. The only difference is who can be affected. So if you have two effects from characters at the same realm that interact with each other, the resultant effects are only hostile towards the enemies of that realm. But if you have two effects owned by mages of opposing realms, then the results of that effect, the resultant effect created by an interaction between those two effects, will affect both realms. So if you have that example of fire and water makes steam, if there's steam that is an area that deals damage, and it came from the effects of a water mage, which is Viking, and a fire mage, which is Arthurian, then Arthurians and Vikings standing in the steam cloud will both take damage, because part of that effect was generated by both,
as well as any TDD that.
Yeah, and of course TDD will take damage, because they would take damage no matter what. So
yeah.
Devour asks, is there any way a solo character can have fun in this game? Do you have to be grouped to harvest resources even?
Oh, absolutely. We absolutely want to support solo play in the game. Especially crafters. I think crafters are one of probably the best choices if you wanted to solo, because you can just go out and craft things by yourself. You can, stay in your house and craft things by yourself. The only time you will really need help is if you are going someplace dangerous. You're going to want other people to come with you to protect you, or if you're going into doing siege battles, because crafters are especially good at operating and constructing and maintaining siege engines. So crafters are a really good choice for that. Scouts are a really good choice. Some combat classes are less good and others are more good at soloing, depending. You don't probably want to play a solo healer, because healers aren't very good at dealing any kind of damage, and there wouldn't be much to do if you can't support anybody with them. So some classes yes, some classes no, but we definitely want there to be avenues for play for soloers. We're making sure that there are objectives and things to go out and do in the world if you are by yourself, as well as things to do as just a small group, and then things to do as a large group.
And we're also working on making sure that there's things to do kind of with other people without making any group commitments, if that makes sense. Like you don't have to join a guild or join a warband or join something in order to go out and experience some of the group content. If you want to siege a castle or whatever, you can kind of participate without having to make any commitment with a large group is kind of a thing we're trying to aim for too, because like a siege battle, doing that solo, it's not really valuable, because you need a bunch of people to take down the castle and everything. But being able to solo and being able to just find a siege that you can kind of join is something we're trying to allow players to do who are solo through the campaign system and other things in the game, so that you can still go out and be like, I like to mostly play by myself all the time, but I can just find some group activities without being part of a guild.
Yeah, it sort of depends on what you mean by being solo, right? If you mean like totally playing all by yourself and there's nobody else around, and then just maybe engaging in like 1v1s and things, that's sort of one thing. But like JB was saying, you could also mean that you're just not in a group. And if there's a campaign or something that says, hey, there's a big battle going on over here, if you're going to play like a stealth character, let's say, you can go off over there and participate in that battle by yourself and not be in a group with anybody, but still be effective and still be rewarded for participating in that. Even though there are a bunch of allies around, you're not necessarily directly associated or affiliated with those other allies. You're just sort of on the same team and using their presence to help accomplish an objective that you couldn't have accomplished by yourself.
Velor asks, because the islands will be moving around in the world based on occupation, does this mean that we can expect naval combat?
Well, I would like to do naval combat, and I've mentioned more than once that I think that would be one of the first expansion things, like major developments after launch that I would like to see us do. But that's definitely not planned for launch. Naval combat is a very big endeavor. There's a lot of things that would have to go into that, the assets, the code behind it, the balancing and everything. So that's something that we're not planning on doing for launch. The boats are going to be on paths, basically, if you're familiar with the way in a lot of MMOs boats have worked, where it just takes you from point A to point B. There's some scheduling for that where the players can possibly have some influence over. But for the most part, it's just boats go from port to port and drop people off and enable you to get from one place to another, but don't really engage in full-on player-controlled combat with one another in these fleets and things that hopefully at some point after launch we'll perhaps get into as an expansion.
Mumblefish asks, will there be any defensive-oriented BPOs, like wooden spikes, fences, barricades, etc.?
Oh yeah, for sure. And that's not necessarily to say that those are defensive, right? Because if you're going to attack an enemy castle or something, and there's a big open field in front of it, you don't have any cover, you're going to want to deploy some barricades or something that you can hide behind while you're shooting back and forth and maybe protect your siege engines or some of your other deployables that are more vulnerable. So you might want to have some of those things to be field fortifications that are defensive in that they're defending you, but that are used in an offensive capacity as sort of these portable and easily deployable things rather than the more defensive fortifications like actual castle walls and things that you can only really put together on your own plot.
ILR on the YouTube chat asks, will the UI log actions upon it in a context-sensitive way and possibly allow players to script their own autocomplete functions to speed up tedious clicking?
So some things you're going to be able to automate. I'm not sure what all actions you're going to refer there. Like if you're talking about like setting up skill bars or switching and stuff, we're going to try to make that as easy as possible. Most of the UI interactions, we'll try to make them as not tedious as possible. But again, the UI is customizable, so that even if you want to like change or automate how any of that works, you could do it with UI modding without it having a scripting system built into our UI itself. The whole UI is built on JavaScript, which is a scripting system. So most all of the UI you'll be able to just script however you want if you so desire and have the capability to do that by knowing JavaScript. So I hope that answers that.
So certain things will require player interaction. Like you can't just script your character to be played like a bot, right? Where it's just executing its own abilities, following a script, just doing its own logic. But then if you wanted to, say, be able to hotkey a certain combination of things to happen, like open your UI and split a stack of things in your inventory or something, like things that don't necessarily require a mouse click are scriptable or could have UI.
Yeah, we do require actual input for certain actions, like executing a skill, for example. You can't like macro the UI using the JavaScript to just execute skills for you. Those require actual like interactions of an input device on your computer. But like splitting stacks in your inventory or managing your permissions for your guild and stuff, you can do that. You can automate that all you want, or it's also available just through it's going to be available, and what is right now available just through our web API. So you don't even have to be in the game client to do that. So like you can manage all your guild stuff for like who's in what positions and permissions and all that. You'll be able to do that just through any kind of app that can talk to a web service, just over HTTP. So it should be pretty open for you to do what you need to do.
Hambone Flex on the YouTube chat asks, for support players, how is currency going to be awarded in group battles? I know fighters get money for killing enemies, but I would rather be tossing healing pebbles, yelling, kick his ass, Seabass.
So support is actually one of our archetypes, but that's not what you're talking about if you're talking about healing. In order to play any class that has a specific function, whether that's support, which is primarily focused around buffs and debuffs, or healers that are focused around healing, obviously, or for some of our heavy fighters doing just protective, defensive sort of things, the idea is to make sure that you're rewarded for the things that you're doing and the things that your class is meant to do. So healers will get rewards for healing, and that's not healing all damage, that's context sensitive to damage that's inflicted by enemies, so you can't just go off and damage yourself a bunch of times or have your friend jump off a cliff and take a bunch of damage and constantly heal them to get a bunch of credit, because it wouldn't count, because that healing doesn't really matter because it's not inflicted by enemies, right? And so we want to make sure that healers get rewarded for healing, but only in the context where it actually matters. So if you're in a fight with a bunch of enemies, a bunch of your allies are taking damage, you're keeping them alive by providing healing, and you're putting, you know, buffs on allies and debuffs on enemies and things like that. Damage is not the only metric. Healing will be a metric. Defense will be a metric. There will be a lot of different things that we're keeping track of. And as we've talked about a little bit, our main progression avenue is by increasing the progression of each individual ability component. And so all of that is driven by usage. So the use of each individual ability will drive its own progression. So if you're using something a lot, your character will get better at doing that. Not necessarily your character gets better as a whole, but you'll get better at the specific things that you're doing. So it's more of a skill-based system than just a level-based system for your character, if that sort of makes sense. So the things that you're doing are the things that you'll get better at.
Adria Cortesia asks, are there plans to make the world itself more dangerous? Not just with things like swamps with poisonous gas, but more dangerous wild beasts in the world, or the world itself, parenthesis, Veil related?
Well, more dangerous than what, I guess is the question. We definitely don't want a just empty, boring, stale world, right? We want to make sure that we have a world full of things that you can go out and explore and experience, and that will be threatening and dangerous at times, especially in places that are meant to be dangerous. So if you're just wandering around, say, in territory that is secured by your realm, that's near where your starting island has its main landing point, that's not going to necessarily be the most hazardous of places. But as you get into dungeons, as you get into the far middle area of the map where there's a lot of conflict and things going on, there's going to be some more dangerous things that you're going to encounter. And so we're not trying to make it so that the world is so full of hazardous stuff that you can't just get engaged in PvP and that you're constantly bothered by all of these things. But in certain areas and around certain objectives and things like that, we will have some hazardous NPCs. And we have said that there is PvE in our game. It's just not a source of progression. And so there will be things that are threatening to you besides just environmental hazards. So that does mean, you know, hazardous creatures and monsters and things like that you will have to deal with at times. But we want to make sure that that's not too overbearing, because we don't want to turn this into a mandatory PvE style of game. So it's still primarily focused on fighting other players, but there will be other hazards out there that you will have to deal with.
Okay, we have a combo question. Mumblefish asks, in regards to ports and shipping routes, will they be player defined? And Laudoween asks, will there be land-based fast travel routes that players can define?
So, as far as the ports, we'll see. We haven't really gotten into the development of that feature yet, because we don't have all of our islands and we don't have all of the map and things laid out quite yet to have that ready. The idea is to have those be point to point and then have the routes adjust based on where those are. So the islands will move, obviously, and so they can't be like fully static. But if there's a route that says this goes from island A to island B, and the locations of island A and island B sort of change, the route would have to change to facilitate that. But we'll see. It depends on if we... It depends on how much time we have to put into that feature and how difficult it turns out to be, as a lot of things do, because we can say in design we want certain things to happen, but then as we get into doing some investigation and programmers take a look at it and figure out how hard it would be, it can be things like, well, the easy version of this would take a month, but the hard version of this would take 6 months, and so we go with the easy version, right? And so we'll see how that goes, but certainly we want to make sure that there are routes that go from place to place and that players can control and defend those and have the mechanisms that they need to get where they're going. The exact details of that we'll get into, I think, further along when we have more specific information that we can be sure we're correct about before we go forward and put it into the game. As far as the fast travel routes for on islands, those are going to be more static because the islands themselves don't deform or anything. They're pretty much the way they are, other than their location in the world. And so the fast travel routes, as we talked about at length at other times, have been roads, right? Where there will be design-informed, design laid out roads in terms of where they go and where they're located, and so that allows us to say there are certain places where roads go through, there are certain places where plots go, and there's not problems where players are going out and putting plots in the way of where other players want to put roads, and so there's all these conflicts. It's more or less statically defined. There's the possibility that players will be able to add on to that as well, or at least decide where of the allowable roads they actually want to utilize. So if there's a lot of allowances for roads can go in all of these different places, but then players still have to go out there and build them and maintain them, and if they get destroyed or they just wear down over time and they don't get maintained, they go away. That's something that hopefully we can get into, so that roads aren't just 100% static and always exactly where they are, but their possibility space is defined, and then players can, within that possibility space, specifically place where the active roads that they want to use are, and maintain the roads that are the most important to them, and have different expenditures to make their roads better, and spend the most on the roads that matter the most to them, and things like that. So we'll see how that all goes as well. Again, we're not into that part of the game and building out those features yet. We're still in basic combat testing, basic scenario based testing, where we're going in and just staging battles and getting our scalability up and having our class basics sort of covered. So once we get further along into building out the open world and having the territory conquest game and putting all those things together, then we'll have a lot more to do with things like how does travel work exactly, and how do roads work, and what are all of these features that are necessary for the really open world part of the game.
Hypnopompic asks, can we macro command swapping one-handed weapons, for example, or just drag and drop out of combat kind of thing?
All right, so we have equipment slots that are kind of there's a difference between like readied and equipped weapons. You have 2 slots that are one-handed weapons, which is kind of like your left hand, right hand, and then you have 1 slot that is two-handed weapon. When those are equipped, you'll be able to just hotkey swap between readied and your one hand, each hand, or the two-hander. But if you're going to change what's in those slots, is going to have a little bit of a time to it. So it's not something you can just open your inventory up, drag a new two-handed weapon onto your slot, and then in the middle of combat use it right away, like instantly. There'll be a small equip time for that. But your readied stuff is going to be much quicker, so you can just swap between that. So you can kind of make the choice where choices matter before you go into battle of what you're going to actually be equipped with when you go out into battle.
Unoian asks, healing metric is kind of tricky. In Deoc, it's askew. The RP gain of healers far eclipses everything else. How are you approaching that?
Well, so I don't want to specifically get into the mechanics of Deoc, but as long as there is a reward for healing. So if, say, there was 1 point of progression for every point of healing and 1 point of progression for every point of damage, that probably wouldn't work, right? Because if your expectation is healers are healing way more points, because if you have 1 healer in a group of 8 players and you have 7 players worth of damage or 6 players worth of damage, or however you want to break that up, right? There are way more players doing damage than there are players doing healing, but that player doing healing is healing way more players, so their amount of healing per minute, as you would calculate it, right, would be higher. And so looking at it more from that perspective, so how many abilities is the healer using, right? As we said, our progression is based on ability usage, right? So how many times is the healer using their ability? And then how effective was each of those uses, right? If its potential is to heal, 500 points of damage, but they're using it on players that only have, 200 points of damage taken, then they're not getting the full potential out of their ability, versus a lot of the damaging characters are dealing a lot more damage, so their damaging ability does 500 points of damage, and then that damage is reduced by the armor of the character they're attacking is reduced, since they're dealing less damage than its potential. They're not getting the full potential of their damage ability either. So there's back and forths here and there, but the overall point is that we're trying to make sure that our progression of the rate of advancement of abilities is based on how many times they're being used, with some modifiers layered on top of that for how effective those uses were. So healers hopefully won't have way overreaching pacing in their advancement, but it's less structured in the same way that it is in Dark Age, where it matters like what your realm rank was, right? In this case, we're talking about what is your progression level with your ability components, and so you're not both reaching for the same thing, where damage characters are reaching for their new components, healing characters are reaching for their new components, and everybody's trying to get new things, but they're not looking up like on a shared table of global benefits to their character. They're just trying to get better at the things that they're doing and then learn new things beyond that. So it's a pretty different case, and has a very different focus. And so I don't think that there's that strong of an analogy there, but the overall idea is that for all the different characters doing all their different things, as long as you're using your abilities, you're progressing, and the progression rates for different characters have modifications on them based on how effective those abilities are being used, and can be tuned overall anyway. So if there are some abilities that are just really easy to progress, we can have some modifiers on there that say, well, because this is something that we expect you to be using all the time, right, as opposed to something else which is like a rare ability, like a special ability that only gets used once in a while, we can say that the common ability progresses slower than the rare ability, which either has a long cooldown or an expensive cost or something else that makes it really rare and special, and not something that you're just using all the time. Common things can progress slower, rare things can progress faster, so that you can have a reasonable time to advance each of those things independently. So there are a lot of things to take into account when you're talking about progression, and but we're trying to make sure that everything is balanced out as best can be, so that you play your character and have a reasonable feeling that you're gaining and getting better with the things that you're doing.
Let's see. So 5-minute warning, folks. 5-minute warning. I'm looking for a really nice question to end with. Preferably one that both these guys could have an answer to. Let's see. 2 people asked about healer vision.
Okay.
And is that still happening? Are there any more details? What does it mean? What does it do?
Well, so the idea of what it does, it's not something that is happening right now. Obviously, we're just still working on the basics of getting abilities to be functional with the ability builder and all that, and all the new characters and all the new visual effects and everything. And once we get a little bit further along in the improvements to get all the ability builder stuff working, then we will have the ability to do some of these other things, like the air system, like healer vision, like some of these other sort of secondary features that are beyond just the base functionality of building and using abilities, but actually having more advanced gameplay features. The idea of what healer vision does is it allows you to see who is damaged beyond just the members of your own warband who are going to have a display on your HUD. So if you just look around in the game world, you can sort of see which characters need to be healed, as opposed to just having only the view of just your own warband available to you. That's still something I would like to be able to do. And previously, when we had using individual body parts, we had said, well, what if we do sort of highlight of the character that shows which part of their body is damaged? But still, I think it has a use to say who even is damaged in this large group of people, rather than having, if you have a group of 100 or 1,000 players, right? Having 1,000 health bars on your screen is not going to be workable. So if we show sort of a heat mapping or some kind of a color shift or some form of highlighting to those characters to say, maybe you should check out this guy, he's probably hurt and needs your help, I still think that has value, and so it's still something I would like to get into prototyping and evaluating internally. But it's going to be a little bit farther down the line, because we're sort of in this place where we have the basics getting pieced together for the ability builder and characters in general, and a little bit later, hopefully, we'll have still the capability to do something like that.
Okay, this might be a nice one to end with. Lotoween asks, what is the funnest aspect of any game that you've had to work on together since being at CSE?
I think this
This is the only game we've worked on.
It's the only game we've worked on at CSE.
At CSE.
What's the funnest aspect that you've worked on together?
Indeed.
What part have you found the funnest so far?
The funnest.
Yeah.
I would think. I mean, I really like making designs on the UI. I find that fun.
All the wireframes and stuff?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And coming up with that and then like getting them in. I mean, I don't know if that's really fun. I mean, I think it's fun.
Well, it is. I mean, it's whatever. Fun is whatever you think it is, right?
Yeah.
So if that's the part, like, it is like something that I don't work with JB directly very much of the time. The times
Yeah.
we do work together are on things that are like design related, which is like, well, how does this even work? Like, what is this functionally supposed to do? And then what is the user experience for how to interact with that, right? And so we'll get up on the whiteboard and we'll draw circles and squares and arrows and lines and things to try to figure out, okay, how is this supposed to work? What does the player do? When you click this, what happens? And things like that. And that's probably the fun thing that we get to do is draw all that out and sort of problem solve and in real time, as opposed to like writing a bunch of notes, sending a document, reading a document, taking notes, making comments, and sending those back and forth. I think it's more fun when we do like whiteboard meetings to just sort of roughly concept something out. Yeah, just scribbling
UI
things on the board.
ideas on the thing and go over all the requirements that we need for the UI and then just try to make something up.
Yep.
All right. Shall we close down the stream?
I guess so. Thanks for asking all your questions and paying attention to us, as always. I'm not sure what we're doing for testing, if anything, this weekend. Nobody has told me. But if there's anything, it'll be in an email, so always pay attention to that. And I think that's all we've got for today.
Thank you.
Yep, thanks a lot. See you later.
See you later.
See you later.